Welcome back to Secrets of the CIA. My name's Danny Wallace, and over the next couple of hours we're going to be revealing more of the CIA's most classified operations. The CIA was set up to protect the West from communism, but in doing so, it had employed Nazis in Europe, experimented with drugs in America, and overthrown democratically elected leaders in the Middle East. The next stop on this secret world tour of mayhem was Africa. The CIA's main concern in Africa was to prevent the Soviets from gaining any sort of stronghold in the continent, and efforts were focused on one huge country at the heart of the region, the Congo.
Within days of formal independence, Congo was in complete turmoil. Patrice Lumumba, who was the prime minister at that stage, was asking the Soviets to help. There were hundreds of Soviet advisors flying into the airport and who were then broadcasting propaganda to the Congolese army.
Lumumba's behaviour was completely unacceptable to the CIA, so the agents in the Congo began to look for a replacement, and they found one in a young man called Mobutu.
CIA first spotted Mobutu as a potential collaborator in 1960. They regarded him as very intelligent, very immature, but very promising.
A new chapter begins in the dark and tragic history of the Congo with the return to Leopoldville of deposed Premier Lumumba, following his capture by crack commandos of strongman Colonel Mobutu.
On January 17th, 1961, Lumumba was dragged into the jungle, beaten and then murdered by troops loyal to Mobutu. The CIA had got its way. Their man Mobutu was now in charge of the Congo, and the Soviets were no longer welcome there.
Lumumba was removed to an army prison.
He was a very helpful, earnest, clever, non-ideological young man from very humble, rather complicated background, who Western people found very useful.
He was very much indeed a strong man, a strong personality, and Congo became his backyard. He had everything for himself. He controlled everything himself. And thus he became, even at the time, even the most richest guy on earth.
Over his lifetime, he was reckoned to have taken 4 billion, equivalent to half of the Congo's GDP. And what did he spend it on? Lots of quotes-unquote palaces, which included a whole compound in Gabadalite. It looked like Disney, but it cost a great deal of money. Mobutu had a small airport, but not so small that Concorde couldn't regularly land and take off there, because Concorde was hired for shopping trips to Paris. There is no question that the CIA knew the order of theft. Of course they knew.
Mobutu's greed was matched only by his cruelty, and it was the people of the Congo who paid the high price during his 32 years in power.
He became like an animal. He became like a lion.
Je m'appelle Mobutu.
People were very scared about Mobutu. If you touch Mobutu's politics or Mobutu's interests, you are finished, man. You are gone.
I think if you look back, what becomes harder and harder to defend is the fact that the CIA kept supporting Mobutu until the 90s. I find that astonishing. Today, Congo is a source of tremendous instability. It's had a civil war that has led to 3.7 million deaths. It is one of the most unstable, poorest and most anarchic countries in Africa. I've now spent 10 years in Africa, and every African I've ever met believes that if something happens in his country that is negative and damaging, the CIA was behind it. But they have good reason to think that, because the CIA did intervene time and time again. It did make sure that dictators ended up running the show. It did make sure that human rights atrocities were hushed up. So the paranoia that is still there which makes every African you meet think that the CIA is probably behind that, is completely justified.
Disinformation, fake leaks and double agents are all a key part of being a spook. I don't need to tell you that. And in the CIA, the job of deciding who's telling the truth and who's lying falls to one of the most suspicious and secretive departments in the CIA, counterintelligence. In 1952, this department was run by James Jesus Angleton. He trusted no one.
Scientists, diplomats, dissident groups, tourists, the French, students, the CIA, all playing the same theme.
Angleton was convinced every defector from the East who gave the CIA information was actually a double agent planted by the KGB. So he either ignored them or had them locked up. So the CIA had a problem. No information from people on the ground in Russia. Their solution was revolutionary and high-tech. They invented the spy plane, and by mistake, they invented the UFO at the same time.
The United States and the Soviet Union were absolutely paranoid about each other's nuclear capabilities. The Soviet bomber fleet and the Soviet ICBM inventory was of particular interest to the United States because it really didn't have any information about them. And that's why it needed spy planes in particular to go over those sites, take photography, capture imagery, and take that information back to the US. A spy plane needs to be subtly different from any other kind of aircraft. It needs to be able to fly, often at great heights, to overcome the defences beneath it. It needs to fly at great ranges. And these two attributes led to inventors of the day really pushing the envelope in terms of what an aeroplane could do. That really tested the Lockheed Skunk Works, which was this special secret entity that was set up to create secret programs like this.
This new technology had to be kept top secret if it was going to be successful. Something that's huge, metal and flies in the sky is fairly difficult to keep secret, so the CIA used a convenient excuse. When Americans spotted these planes flying over their houses, the CIA encouraged them to believe they'd actually seen a UFO.
We have received and analyzed between 1,000 and 2,000 reports. However, there have been a certain percentage of this volume of reports that have been made by credible observers of relatively incredible things.
The CIA didn't like awkward questions being asked of these kind of high-flying aircraft. And in fact, we have evidence today that it had encouraged UFO stories as a kind of a veil behind which it could hide some of this spy plane technology.
So, we've seen how far the CIA is willing to go to prevent the spread of evil communism in Europe, the Middle East and Africa, employing Nazis, overthrowing leaders and persuading the world to believe in little green men. So how much further are they prepared to go when the threat is that much nearer to home? Well, on April 17th, 1961, the people of Cuba found out when they came under attack from a full-scale paramilitary assault by the CIA. And it started here, in the Bay of Pigs. The CIA's actions in Cuba were designed to spark a popular revolution against Fidel, who'd come to power via a revolution himself. A revolution against American power in Cuba. This was a fight between the underdog Fidel Castro of Cuba and JFK of the all-powerful USA. Just why was the CIA so keen to invade a country as small as Cuba in the first place?
What could not be tolerated in Washington was a communist island 90 miles off Florida. This was just a non-starter.
As long as it existed, the US's control over the whole of Latin America was in question. So long as Castro was there, that challenge would persist.
People who are young today have got to understand what the Cold War meant. I mean, it was a terrifying 30 or 40 years in the life of the world.
Castro had not been in power more than 9 or 10 months before the CIA started writing memos and knocking on the door of the State Department saying, we have to develop a plan to overthrow this guy. He's uncontrollable, and the masses seem to respond to him in a way that we have never seen before.
The CIA, of course, came up with a plan. They came up with a bad plan, and the military harumphed at it because they knew how bad it was, and intelligence analysts weren't shown the plan because operational people weren't confident with the plan. But this is what the president wanted. So you had a very naive, overrated American president, I might add, in John F. Kennedy, going ahead with the Bay of Pigs, which was just destined to fail.
So just why was this operation destined to fail?
For all kinds of political reasons, American troops could not be seen to be invading Cuba. The political risks were far too high, including possible war with the USSR. So the CIA used Cuban mercenaries. Mercenaries are rotten soldiers. Mercenaries very, very rarely win. You know, they fight for money, they're fat, they're lazy, they're ill-disciplined, they don't know how to use a rifle.
These shots were filmed by enemies of Cuba. A handful of bandits has landed on Cuban soil.
The CIA put together a fighting force of 1,500 anti-communist Cuban exiles who lived in the United States. These weren't army men, but the CIA quickly trained and armed them and sent them off to fight against the professional Cuban army in the Bay of Pigs.
I think if you're looking at, sort of small paramilitary groups of less than 2,000, taking on 35,000 sort of seasoned troops, well, it's a no-brainer. But the fact is they're going to be killed. The CIA were sponsoring a Cuban fighting force as opposed to Americans. So if it's successful, America can wave the flag and saying what a wonderful thing they've done. If it was unsuccessful, what you don't have is body bags coming back and being buried on everybody's TV screens in America in Arlington Cemetery.
The invasion was a total disaster. A, because they didn't know how to fight properly. B, because they kept landing in the wrong places. And C, because the people didn't rise up to help them.
They didn't understand Cuba at all. They didn't understand the nationalism of the revolution. And consequently, they had an operation which became known as a perfect failure. And in the end, it consolidated the Cuban Revolution rather than completing its goal, which is to wipe Fidel Castro off the face of the map.
Cuba will never retreat. Cuba will hold out. Our country or death.
It really was a total catastrophe and left Kennedy with egg all over his face.
Despite getting a beating at the Bay of Pigs, the CIA was still obsessed with getting rid of Fidel Castro. Over the next 10 years, in fact, they admitted to planning to bump him off no fewer than 8 times. But Castro is still there, and Cuba is still communist. Now, after failing to overturn communism in Cuba, across the other side of the world, in Indonesia, the CIA were trying to stop it taking root in the first place. Indonesia was strategically important. It had a huge population, and the CIA believed their Prime Minister, Sukarno, was going to open up the country to communism.
The CIA was against Sukarno because he was too friendly towards the Communist Party in Indonesia. But he was not any kind of communist himself. He was not a communist dupe. But he was, to a certain extent, a Democrat, and he felt the communists had the right to be in the government. But that, for Washington, that was much too much.
The CIA proposed a program of black operations, of covert propaganda that was disseminated through Indonesian newspapers, through Indonesian political parties, through the Indonesian army, that attempted to raise the specter of a looming Indonesian Communist Party takeover of the Indonesian government.
The CIA made a bizarre decision. They tried to blacken Prime Minister Sukarno's name by making the world's first celebrity porn film. They hired a Sukarno lookalike and filmed him enjoying the company of a young lady who wasn't his wife. But the CIA failed to realise that Sukarno was already a famed womanizer, and this home movie had no impact at all on his popularity. So when this amusing attempt to get rid of him failed, the CIA turned to something a lot less funny: black operations. Black operations are top-secret or illegal missions which the CIA perform for the US government that aren't supposed to come out in the open.
Its more serious covert operations in Indonesia were aimed at doing something which was of much more questionable moral legitimacy, sowing confusion within Indonesian society so as to provoke an armed clash between the Indonesian army and the Indonesian Communist Party, which the CIA fully anticipated and hoped would result in a bloodbath and allow for a military takeover of the Indonesian government.
On the night of September 30th, 1965, a low-ranking soldier kidnapped and murdered 6 Indonesian generals. The soldier claimed he carried out this attack to prevent the generals taking over the country in a CIA-sponsored coup. In the confusion that followed these murders, General Suharto and his army blamed the Indonesian Communist Party and mounted a coup to get rid of Prime Minister Sukarno. The CIA had got what they wanted, and Sukarno was driven from power. After the coup, the CIA worked together with the generals to ensure every single communist in Indonesia was killed.
They gave the government of Indonesia a list of citizens who were communists, and this list was used by the government after the coup to start a massacre which took the lives of between 500,000 and a million people.
The United States government, led by the Central Intelligence Agency, helped to facilitate these massacres by providing various forms of communications equipment, money, and small weapons to the Indonesian army. This campaign constituted one of the greatest campaigns of slaughter in modern Asian history. I think, as a historian and as an American, that it is one of the most morally troubling episodes in the history of American foreign policy, and one which the U.S. government has never taken any responsibility for.
It's 1960, and another tiny country in Southeast Asia is about to be used by the CIA to prevent the spread of communism. This time, it's lucky Laos. Now, Laos is tucked away between Thailand and Vietnam. Most people would find it impossible to point out its borders, a problem that they'd share with the CIA, who decided that Laos was the key to winning the war in Vietnam. Laos had enormous strategic importance in the fight for Vietnam. The Vietnamese communists from the north had been using a secret trail which ran through Laos to direct troops, weapons and supplies to fight the US troops in the south of Vietnam. The Americans couldn't invade Laos, so the CIA was called in and ordered to take care of the problem. In the hill villages of North Laos, the CIA spooks made contact with the ancient Hmong tribe. 30,000 of these fierce tribesmen were paid, trained and signed up to fight for the CIA in this secret war in Laos. The tribesmen were happy to fight for the CIA so long as they were allowed to carry on farming and selling their local cash crop, opium. Opium and heroin had always been grown and produced in Laos, but the CIA made it much easier for the tribesmen. Not only did the CIA let them carry on producing heroin, they also made it much easier for them. They set up an airline, Air America, which was used to transport the drugs into neighbouring countries, including Vietnam.
I was a freelance journalist, and I went to Laos to do this story on the source of the heroin and opium that was flooding into South Vietnam. And I was interviewing opium farmers. How much did you produce last year? What did you do with it? And the answers were always the same. We got about 5, maybe 10 kilos. At the end of harvest, we went down to that landing pad. An American helicopter came in, paid us cash for the opium, loaded the opium on the helicopter, and flew away.
The trail of drugs follows the trail of clandestine operations. And there's a very good reason for that. If you're carrying out clandestine operations, you need black money. And you need cooperation from criminals. All right. When you put together black money, untraceable money, and criminals, what does it add up to? Narco-trafficking.
CIA headquarters had no idea what was going on the ground in Laos. Their agents in Laos had to keep the local drug traffickers happy in return for their support. So the CIA got their secret army by turning a blind eye to the heroin trade. But what the CIA hadn't thought about was where this heroin was headed.
It's what I call mission myopia, turning a blind eye, if you will. It was their troops, their aircraft, and they knew about it at the time. So the CIA was a part of that, and they were moral in that sense. They were loyal to their fighters. But they didn't worry about the fallout, what happened downstream. That was somebody else's business.
A huge quantity of the heroin produced by the tribesmen was delivered straight into the hands of the American GIs stationed in Vietnam.
In 1969, we adopted a defensive posture. The troops became demoralized. They were basically confined to fire bases in defensive positions, and time was very heavy on their hand. And the way to make 365 days just go blip and disappear was heroin. And the stuff was cheap. It was sold in every bar, every fire base, little tiny screw cap plastic vials, about $2 a piece. And it was 96% pure heroin. You didn't inject this stuff. You scooped it out and you snorted it. The White House did a survey after the Vietnam War, and they discovered that in 1971, 1/3 of all U.S. combat forces fighting in Vietnam were heroin addicts. If you do the calculus, okay, there were about 70,000 heroin addicts in the United States in 1969. By 1971, there were 80,000 heroin addicts in the U.S. Army fighting in South Vietnam. That means there were probably more American heroin addicts inside the U.S. Army in South Vietnam than there were in the United States.
So, by 1965, less than 20 years after its formation, the CIA had already got mixed up with heroin traffickers, overthrown governments in Asia and Africa, and tried to control people's minds. But there's more. After the break, I'll be flicking through more of the CIA's secret classified files to bring you revolution, murder, and an unlikely style icon.
It was a program of assassination.
We summarily executed more than 20,000 people.
Well, probably the best way to become an icon is to be assassinated by the CIA.